Hello everybody, Jeremy here. Welcome. I'm going to do a new video series where I give a bit of advice and tips on all aspects of editing, the publishing industry, the book world. And the first one, the maiden video tonight, is going to be on self-publishing. Now, self-publishing is increasingly fashionable. It's becoming increasingly popular and common. For many writers, it's the natural choice to secure a readership for their book. But for other authors, it may not necessarily be the first choice. The dream might be a traditional publishing relationship, but they choose to go down the self-publishing route as the second best option. And that in many cases can indeed be so. So tonight for the maiden video on self-publishing, I'm going to give you two advantages of self-publishing and two disadvantages. And I'm a great believer in having the bad news first. So I'm going to begin with the two disadvantages of self-publishing. The number one disadvantage for me in self-publishing has to be finance. It can be very expensive. If you are self-publishing a book, you have to think about everything from editing, proofing the manuscript, then typesetting, then the printing costs to actually manufacture a book. And then you have to go into things like graphic design. A nice cover gives a self-published book a really, really big competitive advantage. If you have a nice, professionally designed, seductive cover that draws the customer in, it just can give a self-published book the edge. Ditto if you're selling it on online channels. A nice thumbnail stands out. It's striking. It's very, very important in selling a book. Beyond that, that's not where the overheads end. You have to consider advertising, promotion, and those kind of costs can just spiral on and on. So to make a long story short, self-publishing a book effectively to ensure you do get those readers, to ensure the book is a success, can be very expensive. So that's the first big disadvantage. That's the first bit of bad news I have for you tonight. The second bit of bad news is a little more difficult to define. It's what I like to call gravitas. Now, don't get me wrong before I say this. There's no doubt that self-publishing is becoming increasingly more mainstream, more fashionable, more acceptable. It's now more common not only to see self-published books, but self-published books are getting more respect. And that's because I think people appreciate that the book industry and the publishing world it has all sorts of problems, saturation, volatility, it has never really fully adapted since the last recession, etc., etc. And people are more accepting of self-published books, that they don't have the same stigma. But despite all that, and despite the fact that's all true, I still think that a traditionally published book with an imprint, a publishing company that has provenance, that has a reputation, can still give a book that edge. So if you get a book off the bookshelf and you open it up and you see the Penguin imprint or the Hachette imprint or the Routledge imprint, it sprinkles that book with a branding magic. It just gives it that gravitas and that provenance. And that is very difficult to replicate in a self-published book. It's not impossible, it's not insurmountable, and look, there's good news as well as bad news here. If you are self-publishing a book, you can compensate for that by giving a lot of time, consideration, and thought to branding the book. But as it stands, it's certainly for me a disadvantage. So they're the two big disadvantages. Finance, first, it can be very expensive. And number two, and equally important, that the traditional publishing house and the logo of a traditional publishing house gives a book a certain gravitas, a certain prestige, a certain provenance that it's hard to replicate in the self-published format. So that's the bad news over with. Let's get on to the good news. Well, I have good news. First item of good news. First advantage of self-publishing. Well, yes, self-publishing is expensive. The costs can spiral. But here's the good news. The good news is because of the nature of the world we live in, globalized world, you can get a lot of very good professional advice and professional services at a pretty good rate. It is possible now by going on to websites like Upwork, LinkedIn, going to your local enterprise office and finding out what kind of professional advice is available in your local economy. It's possible to get very good advice at a good rate. And that covers all levels of the supply chain, from the proofing, editing of the manuscript, up to typesetting, graphic design, printing, production, advertising, promotion. So all of those professional services and professional advice can be obtained. So although it's expensive, if you take it seriously, if you hunt in Upwork and LinkedIn, if you make calls to the local enterprise office, if you hunt out good quality professionals who are willing to provide their advice and services at a cut rate price, it is possible to do it. It's not insurmountable. So that's the good news. The good news is, yes, it's expensive, but with thought, time, research, and consideration, you can bring those costs down quite considerably. The second bit of good news is, I'm going to get to this in a slightly roundabout way, because often when you ask somebody like me in the publishing industry, what's good about self-publishing, if you ask writers, they will often say autonomy. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, they mean by that is if you're self-publishing a book, you have complete control. You are your own publisher, your own editor, your own promoter. You can do what you want. You can say what you want in a manuscript. You don't have to be dealing with an editorial team saying cut this, cut that. You can design whatever cover you want because you're self-publishing the book. There's no marketing department in a publishing company to tell you, no, we don't like that kind of cover. We want this cover. So you are God. You are complete control of your own project. So that's what they mean by autonomy. Now, for me, being honest and being frank, I don't think that is a great advantage, or at least it's not the advantage people imagine it to be. And here's why. I don't think, no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how smart you are, no matter how talented you are, that anyone can do a good job on a book without taking advice. So I don't care how much experience you have. I think to get a self-published book right, to really do a good job, and to get something you can be proud of, that will get you readers and will be a commercial success, I think you need advice. And I think it's a good idea to get a broad range of different opinion and advice. That includes editorial advice on a manuscript, that includes marketing and promotional advice when it comes to promoting the book, and that includes graphic design skills when it comes to designing the book. So I don't think that's for me anyway, personally, being honest, autonomy isn't the great advantage some people hold it up to be. In saying that, what is a big advantage for me in self-publishing is the author maintains control of copyright. That is a very important thing for me. Increasingly, particularly since the last recession, publishing companies are increasingly demanding that the author or his or her agent sells the publishing company ownership of the copyright. I think that's largely a bad thing. Publishing companies, to give them their due, will justify that in saying that if they control copyright, they have a better chance to sell the book either to an international bigger publisher that can bring the author's book to a wider audience, or sell it to a studio or a film production company to option it and turn it into a film. I'm a bit skeptical about that, to be honest. I think the author is a good agent. The good agent can do that for them anyway. And I think it's always, in my view anyway, an advantage for the person who writes the book to maintain as much control as possible over the copyright. I think I think it gives them a commercial advantage, because the more control and more ownership and more stake they have in the material, the more likely they are to reap the commercial rewards. And secondly, even outside from the commercial considerations, I think it is right in principle that the person who wrote the book should, even though he or she may license it to a publisher or